filming and broadcast. This meeting may be recorded and broadcast live on the County Council's website. The meeting may also be recorded and broadcast by the press and members of the public. Please see the filming protocol available on the County Council's website. Adam. Right. Is this going to happen throughout the next hour? All right. Okay. Fine. Apologies for absence. I've got one apology I know about, and that is Councillor Stallard. Declarations of interest. Okay. Well, before we move on to minutes of the previous meetings, there's a few announcements or comments I want to make. First of all, I want to congratulate, on behalf of the Cabinet, all those in Hampshire, 23 of them, who received honours in the New Year's Honours list, and particularly Peter Colnett in Children's Services, who received an MBE for his work, not only for the county, but for the organisation in London that deals with the allocation of capital for schools. He's done a tremendous job. And also I'd like to congratulate the two foster carers who also received MBEs in the New Year's Honours list, and all those the other 20 people in Hampshire who are honoured. It's very gratifying to see that people across the county have received recognition for the excellent work they do. And I'd also like to welcome Councillor Todd to the meeting. Moving on, a few general comments which I thought are worth making. First of all, as many of you will appreciate, and I have a particular interest in this, the really awful fires in Australia. I have asked for a note to be put together that I can write to the two premiers of New South Wales and Victoria to offer them any assistance that we're able to give. The fire service has been involved with this, and I may well do that with the chairman of the Fire Authority, Councillor Carter. Partly because I think this is the sort of thing we do whenever there is a disaster across the world. And secondly, I know that, and I include myself in this particular category, individuals within Hampshire, families within Hampshire, that have relatives living in Australia, and particularly in that part of the country that has been affected. It was mentioned to me earlier when we were talking amongst the Cabinet that the size of the fires covers a large proportion of southern England, if you look at it in terms of the size that the area is covered. They're huge. They do occur every year. This year has been particularly bad for a combination of factors, and obviously we sincerely hope that we can assist them in any way they think is appropriate. I also think it's worth mentioning, as this is the first Cabinet meeting since the general election where we now have a clear path to exiting the European Union at the end of this month, and then following on from that, the trade negotiations that will continue at least until the end of the year. I'm conscious of the fact that living as we do on the South Coast, it's very important that we make representations to government, both as an authority as ourselves, but also together with other authorities, particularly the three unitary authorities, that we are one of the few areas that makes a positive contribution to the Treasury, and therefore it is a mistake if our own needs, particularly for infrastructure, are not at least acknowledged when the funding allocations are made. As many of you know, I'm constantly saying to ministers and others that what is important is to separate the South East from London rather than lumping the two together, because if you do that, you clearly demonstrate the fact the South East is not the rich but the poor relation when it comes to funding from central government for infrastructure. And the final point to make is, of course, a lot of the goods that come into this country or leave this country do so through the two ports, Portsmouth and Southampton. And if they're going to do that efficiently and quickly, the transport links to the north of those ports, thinking particularly the motorways and the A34, have to be upgraded if we're going to actually assist those areas of the country north of London. I'm meeting with the unitaries later this week, and I will be making this point as well, how we can work together to ensure that we get at least a fair crack of the whip when it comes to central funding. That's all I've got for my opening remarks, so we'll carry straight on with the agenda. Minutes of the previous meeting, are you all in agreement? Thank you. Deputations, I know Councillor Todd, you want to say something prior to item, if I can find it, the climate change, item 9, and I'll be asking you to speak at the beginning of that item, if that's all right. And I know we have a number of other members of the public who are interested in various items on the agenda. So if we move straight on, I've done my chairman's announcements a bit earlier than I should have done. It should have occurred after the last two items. My apologies for that. Moving on now to item 6. Councillor Reid.
I think this is an excellent report which I commend to the Cabinet. The point which I the stock market can go down as well as up. So I think it is absolutely right that we resist the temptation to say that that is a done deal and we'll start spending the money. Much better to put it into the bridging reserve and we can review the position again in 3 years' time. And if things are better, good still in 3 years' time, we can make the appropriate decisions at that time. But this is not a time to count our chickens before they've hatched. Apart from that, that's the only comment I think I'd really make on this one.
Thank you, Chairman. This is the latest quarterly report on our now 2 transformation programmes as we're double running T19 and T21. This report mainly focuses on T19 and confirms that 107 million of the £140 million programme has been secured to the end of October. It also reports on some good early progress with T21 with £15 million secured to the same period. As we move forward through this year, the quarterly reports will start to focus more on T21 as we come out of the T19 era and very much concentrate our efforts and our focus on T21 going forward. If I could move to section 5 of the report, if that's okay. Just 4 short references. So paragraph 5.2 sets out the table of where we are with the programme, showing the secured savings to date and showing those that are still amber and red. That's our usual state of play. 5.6 makes reference to Orchard Close and the fact that following a decision in December, we're now back out to a public consultation on a small reduction in the number of beds there. Paragraph 516 makes the point that children looked after numbers appear to continue to be stabilised and under control, which is heartening and very significant in the context of our challenges that we have financially. The graphs in 513 demonstrate that the numbers, generally speaking, for the last 9 months of last year, following the introduction of the Hampshire approach, are generally under control in a good position. Paragraph 521 just reminds everybody that we are now 1 year into the London Borough arrangement as part of our shared services. That's gone very fast. It's also gone very well and successfully, and we are now in the process of looking at other opportunities to take that shared services arrangement further. In section 7, just a brief progress update on T21. Para 7.2 refers to the 15 million of early achievement. Paragraph 7.3 makes the point that between now and March 21, we've got another £31 million of savings from that programme profile to be achieved, along with the run out of T19 and 33 million there. So we've got a £64 million worth of savings to deliver over the next 15 months, which will continue to challenge us and will be a really defining period for the latter programme, but also the closure of T19. All of that in the context of savings of some 480 odd million that we've delivered so far, and the diagram in 3.4, which demonstrates the levels of funding for different government departments over the last decade and how local authorities have tended to fare probably as worse or as bad as any. Last comment from me, in para 7.4, we refer to further public consultations required to support the T21 programme, and that will kick off this month with a consultation on the library service. Thank you.
Colleagues.
The only one I would add is it's largely because Paul used the word savings, which can be, I think, misinterpreted. I think the diagram in 3.7 is one of the most helpful ones that the officers have come up with, because it shows that what we're doing is catering for the increased cost and the increased demand and the increased scope of the services that we provide, not cutting the size of the county council. And that increased cost through inflation and the increased scope through service growth and the growth pressures that we have cost hundreds of millions of pounds, and we can fund that in part through the council tax, but the rest of it has to be done through a redistribution from some of our activities, predominantly into children's services and adult social care, where we have statutory responsibilities. So we're not cutting the size of Hampshire, we're just making sure that we're financially solvent and fulfilling our statutory responsibilities.
Perhaps I could just add one point, and that is that the diagram at 3.4, I think it is, which I know is one that I've referred to on many occasions in the past, that is a graphic illustration of the relative funding increases and decreases of government support in the different areas of the different departments of state. And we see that health funding of the NHS has gone up by 30 billion in the last 10 years, and funding of local government has gone down by 20 billion. We are told that extra funding will be made available to the health service in the coming years. And what I think we have to do as a council is to support those parts of the NHS, i.e. those parts of the NHS responsible for primary and community care, to ensure that the apportioning of funding for the NHS is more in those areas rather than in acute hospitals. Because if we do that, it helps us in social services, both for youngsters and for elderly people. But it also, in the long term, together with the contribution that public health would make, reduces the pressure on the acute services themselves by ensuring that less people turn up at A&E and that we can get people out of hospital more quickly into the community to provide services in the community. And alongside that, I would argue, we need to make very strong representations that care workers are a very important ingredient into ensuring that this happens. Because without the necessary care workers in position, we are always going to be struggling to meet the demand. And a good example of the increased demand is that every year 2,000 more people in Hampshire reach the age of 85. Are there any other comments? Councillor?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just one to make, and Officer did mention the libraries consultation, which actually kicks off this Friday. It is a very important consultation. I suspect it's going to be huge, given what I've seen in other counties when they've reviewed their library services. I do urge all members actually to make their constituents aware of it and to try and take a full part, particularly in the light of the somewhat scurrilous misinformation which has been circulated about 37 libraries out of our 48 being closed. But of course that's complete and utter tripe, and I think we can put that right today. And as our residents will see on Friday, that's simply not the case. But I do hope people will take part and take a full part in it.
Thank you, Councillor Woodward. Yes, I think you made a very good point. I do believe some of the scaremongering that goes on about the services is totally inappropriate and is counterproductive. The fact is we need within our budget to ensure that we're providing a level of services, maximum level of services we can. The nature of libraries themselves is changing, as we know. The larger ones are becoming very important in terms of the extra services they provide beyond lending books, and the smaller ones are very much community hubs, which have an element, at least an element, and probably more than an element of support by the voluntary sector to ensure that they're carrying out functions well beyond the original intention of small libraries. And if we ensure that during that public consultation people realise that we're trying to ensure, alongside balancing the books, making our services fit for purpose for the future. And a good analogy to use in that context is what we've done in social care, in terms of embracing technology in a way that I would argue is probably well ahead of the rest of the country. We can do exactly the sorts of things in the way we carry out our activities in other parts of our work as well. Are you all happy with the recommendations? Thank you. Moving on. NHS NHS long-term strategic delivery. Excuse me. Graham Allen, are you speaking on this one?
Thank you, sir. Yes. So the report, as set out in the papers, is describing the complex and complicated architecture that's been established to respond to the NHS long-term plan across Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, and the role of Hampshire County Council within it. Beyond that, I would say that the report asks Cabinet to consider the recommendations set out in section 2 of the report. Beyond that, sir, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Comment, Cabinet colleagues.
Thank you, Chairman. I would just like to reiterate what you said earlier about the new money that's going into the NHS. I would like to see some of that going into community services to prevent people going into the acutes in the first place. But more than that, I would like to see public health empowered to do more prevention. I don't think by solving the problem in the acutes, by giving the acutes all the money, we are ever going to achieve any results. The money has to go into the community and into the prevention agenda, and I hope the NHS will realise that.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, without wishing to make a speech, prevention is is better than cure. I saw some figures which showed that if a child is obese at 10, then that person will still be obese when they're 50. So early interventions, healthy child programme and giving children the best start in life is what is going to impact on the demands of the NHS long term. And public health is a long-term thing. Well, there are short-term wins as well, but generally we're looking at things long term. Councillor Fairhurst is quite right about investment in public health. It's been shown that the local councils and public health are more effective, 3 times more effective at spending money on public health than the NHS, for example, in terms of improving life by 1 QALY, which is a measurement of quality of life. It costs almost 3.5 times as much if that money's spent in the NHS than it does in public health. So whilst we are providing a lead on public health in the new SDP plan for the NHS, we really do need more funding to go with that, because we can spend it more effectively and ultimately take the burden off the NHS long term.
Councillor Reid.
Yeah, Leader, not a comment on this, but as we were talking about the acutes, I thought for completeness, I'll mention that I am this council's representative on the Hampshire Hospitals Foundation Trust. Personal interest.
Thank you, Councillor Reid. Are we all happy with the recommendations at 2A to E? Moving on to item 9.
Chairman, can I just interrupt you? We've got some additional members of the public who want to sit in for this item, so
Yeah,
we'll
yes.
just give some time for them to join the meeting.
Yeah.
We'll move on to people.
Okay, item 9 is interim progress on climate change strategy and the action plan. I'm going to ask Councillor Todd to speak on this in a second or two. I see he's, and he has, I think I'm right in saying, a certain number of minutes. I've forgotten how long now.
4 or 5.
I think it's 4 minutes, but I'm certain.
Just pause.
Yeah. But I'm just going to pause for a minute, because I understand there's a few members of the public that have a particular interest in this subject who are joining our meeting.
You'll go straight to Stuart and Chitra.
Yes. Yeah. That's fine. Yes. I would just like to welcome all those members of the public that have joined us for this important item on our climate change strategy. Wish you all a happy new year. And I'll ask Councillor Todd, who has 4 minutes to make his points on this particular item. Councillor Todd.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you for the chance to speak on this issue. As you know, I proposed the original motion to Council back in the first half of the year, and have been very actively concerned about the progress of this initiative all the way through. The first thing to say is that I'm very pleased at how seriously Cabinet is taking this, the fact that we have a paper in front of us today. It is serious about the Council's role of leadership. It is thought through on a lot of issues. So there is a lot to like about what is in front of you today. Much promise for the future. So it lays out a structure, it lays out a plan, it lays out priorities, it takes some encouraging initial decisions, such as the decision to change or the strategy on wind turbines and wind farms on the Council's own land. And these are all things I would welcome. It is, however, striking that when it summarises the original motion, it summarises the first part of it, but not the amendment that was added, which received cross-party support, but where I asked that the County Council calls upon the Cabinet as part of its action planning process and reflecting the urgency of the need to address the climate emergency to set a specific schedule of specific dates by which it will pledge to achieve carbon neutrality for the County Council itself and work in partnership with others to seek carbon neutrality for the county as a whole. And so if I was to ask a question to Cabinet or set a challenge to Cabinet, I suppose the word I would pick there would be urgency. The climate emergency is an emergency. It is not something where business as usual is acceptable. And it was striking that despite Council on a cross-party basis having said that we need to declare a climate emergency, and that we need to take urgent action and we need to do more than we are. Recommendation 5 talks about approving the County Council's existing target for 2050. Now, to be fair, it does widen the scope to look at the indirect impact of its activities, but it is also striking that if you look at the councils across Hampshire, you look at the districts with whom you'll be working in partnership, when it comes to your own activities, you will not be in a leadership position. So Hampshire is talking about its own activities being carbon neutral by 2050, Basingstoke 2030, East Hampshire 2030, Eastleigh 2025, Portsmouth 2030, Rushmore 2030, Southampton 2030 and Winchester City Council 2024. So you will be entering the room not as a leader in terms of your own activities and the Council's work to achieve carbon neutrality in the work that it does itself. And so I would ask that the Cabinet consider that. I was disappointed that the paper missed the opportunity even to consider different timings. So it essentially said this is our current timetable, it's 2050. What it didn't do was even evaluate 2040, 2030, 2025, and make a case one way or another as to why that faster speed could not be achieved. So I take the point that in a situation where you're, on the timetable as a whole, it is extremely difficult if the government is not going faster than 2050 to achieve a county-wide zero carbon position faster than the government is prepared to move. But I do think there is an opportunity for greater leadership, and I think that the Council setting forward a more ambitious date would have been a way to do that. So I'd like you to consider that. The second thing is the proposed structure is thorough, but I don't see the put it this way, I don't think we can governance our way out of this. There needs to be action and urgency on the highest priority areas, and I think more could have been done to highlight the Council's leadership role, probably particularly in the area of transport, to go into that in more detail, and to actually ask that a more specific plan looking at how the Council can take a leadership role, not just in the road system, but also in public transport and encouraging more sustainable travel. and highlight the highest impact areas for the most urgent action. So if there was a second request, it would be that the Cabinet consider requesting officers to come back with the highest impact areas with the greatest urgency in terms of what plans should look like, and I would highlight everything transport and movement related within that. And then the last thing I would request is that I think it is good that Cabinet is giving this attention. I think it's good that it's meeting in public to discuss it. I think it needs to continue to do so, and I think it would be good as a way of driving the urgency that is so important on this issue, if you could set a date for this issue to come back to Cabinet so that we can see that real progress has been made on the most important issues of priority, and possibly also that if you're not prepared to take the decision today, you're in a position to have officer input on the practicalities of a faster date for achieving zero carbon for the Council as a whole. So those are my three requests to you, and thank you for the opportunity to say a few words.
Thank you, Councillor Todd. Be assured we will take into account, certainly in the future, the comments you've made. I would expect you to pressurise us to do more sooner. That's your job. And I appreciate what you've suggested. I think the only other point I'd make is that I'm a great believer, and always have been, in what I will call practical environmentalism. There's always going to be a balance between very optimistic targets and targets that are too easy to achieve in the first place. It's stretching and achievable targets that we will try to aim at in the Council. I take the points you make about district councils. I would probably argue that their task is a lot simpler than ours. I don't know. But at the end of the day, I want to ensure that we have stretching but achievable targets. And if it's possible, yes, we will bring forward the 2050 target, but we'll only do so if we feel we are able to do it realistically, and if obviously we have the funding to achieve it. So thank you for your contribution. I'll now ask Stuart Jarvis to, as Director of the Environment, Economic and Highways, to speak.
Thank you very much, Chairman. The purpose of the report before members today is an interim progress report on the development of this climate change strategy and action plan. And the point I want to make really is that, as the leader has suggested, the County Council has embarked on setting an effective strategy to deliver on proper targets. The first stage of that was to have some widespread community engagement, which we've done in the autumn, and the purpose today really is to ask members to agree the targets, which we can then translate through into an action plan to deliver those. And I would suggest that the report sets out a reasonable roadmap for achieving that, and also talks about the way in which we have highlighted that the County Council has an important leadership role, as Councillor Todd acknowledged, but Hampshire County Council accounts for 1% of emissions in Hampshire. So if we're actually serious about tackling climate change, then we need to tackle the wider Hampshire position, not concentrate exclusively on the County Council's own activities. And we've already had quite a good track record and made significant progress on reducing our own carbon footprint. It really is now time to look at the wider Hampshire and the County Council playing its leadership role in that. It's important, I think, therefore, in that context, to note that we can't do these things on our own. A lot of this work is dependent on influence and being able to work with others. And it's particularly at two levels. One is the national level, because without government action, no one will achieve carbon neutrality that early. It needs national action on some big areas, and it needs local action and community-based action to tackle things at the more community level. And we all need to change and make changes to our lifestyle if we're actually going to deliver effective response to the climate change challenge before us. I think the report also makes it clear that as well as reducing carbon emissions in the county, it's going to be important to make Hampshire as resilient to the inevitable impacts of climate change that's already in the system. And again, the floods that happened up in the north of the country are another reminder of the impact that severe weather events are likely to have, and all the predictions are that they will become more severe and more frequent, and therefore, again, I commend the fact that we need to look at investing in making Hampshire more resilient as well as trying to reduce our carbon footprint. The report takes members through a series of the thinking behind that and gets to the point of the recommendations. It does make the point that if it's possible to accelerate from the 2050 target, then every opportunity should be taken to do that. But I would suggest that that's critically dependent on central government early action and commitments to change some of the things at the national level in order to help make that a meaningful target rather than just an aspiration. It's also important to note that the strategy needs to cover all county council services. It isn't only about transport, it is about the county council activities across the board and how we go about doing them. And it's important, therefore, that the strategy recognises that and addresses those issues. But it is also particularly important that we engage residents in the process, because without residents making those decisions and changing their lifestyles, then we won't ultimately be successful and effective in tackling climate change. It's important to work with partners, and a lot of effort's already gone into sorting some of those things out and beginning to have that meaningful engagement. The Hampshire Partnership Board has repurposed itself into looking at Hampshire 2050, and we had a very successful first meeting around climate change and trying to engage with a range of partners. And Chairman, for me, one of the most heartening things about our engagement to date has been the willingness of other organisations and the enthusiasm to want to share in setting targets, working together on the same assessment tools, and actually wanting to pool resources and to work effectively towards achieving effective overall results for Hampshire as a whole, rather than being about individual organisation action in isolation. It's really important. It's also really important that we engage with local communities, the climate groups, as well as other government organisations and those involved. And again, later this week, Chairman, you're hosting a parish council event where we're actually doing some work with parish councils across Hampshire, again, to try and promote this agenda and to try and secure their buy-in to local action at the community level to help deliver on some of these key areas. There are a number, again, Councillor Todd mentioned a couple of them, some suggested quick wins that we suggest that we're asking Cabinet today to approve ahead of the strategy, including revoking the policy that prohibits consideration of wind farms on county council land, but also, importantly, does ask Cabinet's endorsement to a radical review of the local transport plan. And therefore, I think, far from ignoring transport, this report puts transport at the heart of the County Council's response. And until we actually have in place the policies that are defensible around requiring a different approach to transport and access to new development, for example, it won't be possible to enforce those things through the planning system. So it is important that we do it in a measured way, but I would argue that this report recognises the importance of transport as the main source of emissions in Hampshire and sets out the most effective thing that the County Council can do in the short term, which is to change transport policy to recognise the importance of air quality and climate change at the heart of that policy. It also recognises the need to do things, for example, about tree planting and carbon sequestration through things like rewilding verges, and proposes some practical action around doing some different ways of managing highway verges and highway amenity land to try to help improve carbon take-up by tree planting and landscape management and other measures. And I'd finally draw attention to work also underway to review the local flood risk management strategy, which will become particularly important. And again, as we sit here today. Groundwater levels in parts of Hampshire are high again. It's been one of, if not the wettest autumn in the last 100 years or so, and it is a forceful reminder of the impact that events like groundwater flooding can have on communities. There was a devastating effect last time round. This time, hopefully, the scheme that we built at Hambledon will survive the test and actually help to deal with that, and the work that's well advanced in places like Buckskin and Romsey on projects there. It will also help, but there's a lot more to do, and we know that we need to refresh their approach to flood risk management as well. So, Chairman, with that in mind, I commend the recommendations to the Cabinet.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Councillor Humby, would you like to comment?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'll make a few points. Stuart has covered, the Director has covered a few of them, but I will run through a few of the others. As he said, this is an interim update on progress made in developing our strategy and action plan since declaring the climate emergency in July back in 2019. The report proposes targets for mitigation and resilience for both Hampshire County Council and the Hampshire area that are essential to the development of an action plan and strategy that will set out how we propose to meet those targets. So it's Hampshire the place, not just the authority. We are aligning with national government to be able to take advantage of changes in national policies and new initiatives. That will enable the County Council to take action in areas where it has influence but limited direct control. So lining ourselves up for there as opportunities arise, we will be prepared and ready to take advantage of those opportunities as and when they arise, and then to accelerate our response. I think we've got to understand what our direct control is, if you like. It's a bit limited in terms of the County Council, but what we can do, our important role for us is a leadership role that we have in bringing all those partners together, and it is only by working in partnership that we'll be able to achieve. But as Stuart said, our own emissions represent a very small proportion, 1% of the whole of Hampshire's emissions. Therefore, we have to balance our responses carefully to focus on what will have the biggest impact. Focus needs to be on the biggest emission sources, and Councillor Todd has already mentioned transport, and indeed Stuart has as well. But it's transport and the domestic in those two areas where our focus needs to be. They are the biggest areas that we need to be concerned about. But we have, I suppose, limited but direct control, but can have significant influence. We can't always make the decisions on those, but we can certainly, as a county, have significant influence in those areas. But the only way you can do that is to work in partnership. And we need to work with our public sector partners, businesses and communities. And this will run through the whole thing that I've been talking about really in terms of partnership working. No district or borough organisation, business can do this on their own. And then we need to be working, as Stuart said, nationally as well. One of the key things has already been mentioned, set out some early actions, particularly the review of the local transport plan. I think this is really significant. We've already mentioned, and as I say, Stuart has as well, in terms of transport being one of the main issues. So this review will tackle significant issues such as demand management, public transport, use of road space and appropriate patterns and forms of development, with radical shifts in policy to more sustainable and less car dependent. And this is why we continually talk about the districts and boroughs and the responsibilities they have through planning. There's one area where we very much need to be joined up. No, the districts and boroughs can't do it on their own, and nor can we. We need to be working in partnership. Domestic emissions are perhaps harder to tackle. In the past, the county has run major insulation schemes funded by government. If such schemes become viable again, Hampshire will be ready to take advantage of them. And I mentioned this earlier in terms of running along those same timescales as these opportunities arise, we will take advantage of them. In the interim, working with local communities will be critical in galvanising individual actions to tackle their own household emissions. So this is where we get into change of habits and mindset. And if it's okay, Mr Chairman, I will ask Councillor Warwick, who's leading on this, for us to speak when I finish, if that's okay. Our focus since declaring a climate emergency has been on partnership, working and engagement. And the newly established Hampshire 2050 Partnership had its first event back in November 2019, focusing on climate change, which was extremely positive and reinforced that partnership working will be critical. This partnership brings together leaders of chief executives from all across the districts, the boroughs and unitaries, as well as the wider public sector. Indeed, at the first event, the keynote speech from Dr. Hugh Ellis reinforced the case for clear, well-planned, decisive action to reduce carbon emissions and on resilience to address the impacts of climate change. We have been actively engaging with our district partners, ensuring that actions we develop do not duplicate but complement and enhance and add value, understanding the opportunities and barriers on how we can work together to maximise our impacts. There again, this continual theme of partnership working. We'll be hosting a parish event, as you've heard already, on the 9th of January, again with a focus on climate change and partnership working. We've also been working closely with the Forestry Commission, the Woodland Trust and Plant Life to form a strategic alliance that will help shape and develop our thinking and activities around tree planting and management, alongside transforming our management of verges. Progressing a programme of tree and wildflower planting on highways, amenity land, will help to kickstart this work. So that's some of those early gains we can look at doing already. This is something we can do straight away. So overall, as the County Council, we have to use our resources widely to tackle climate change, to maximise the impact across the county. This will require a response from every part of the organisation, not just the environment sector. Everything we do as a council will need to be reviewed, as set out in the report. But today, Mr Chairman, I'm also very pleased that we have now appointed a strategic lead for climate change, and a team will be established in the coming weeks. This will give us the capacity to progress a strategy and action plan and continue the critical partnership that we've already started. Thank you, Mr Chairman. And if it's okay, I'll ask Councillor Warwick to add a few comments.
Thank you, Councillor Humby. Councillor Warwick.
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman, Councillor Humby and Stewart. And I just wanted to thank Chitra as well for a very thorough report. I know Chitra's now building an excellent team around her, so thank you for that. Following on, we declared a climate change emergency in July 2019. And I just want to emphasise that the Hampshire County Council is taking the climate change emergency extremely seriously. And we are committed to taking meaningful action to both reduce carbon emissions and to build resilience. How successful we will be will depend entirely on engaging and working with our partners, our stakeholders and communities. We started this very well back in October last year, where we had a community event where we had a range of groups representing various groups across Hampshire came and joined us. We had a very good interactive conversation, a lot of positive outcomes. We met with Winchester Action on Climate Change, with the Alton Action on Climate Change, Extinction Rebellion and Friends of the Earth. What the outcome from that event was that Hampshire has a very important leadership role to play to unlock opportunities and remove barriers for change. This week there will be a parish event again, so I think parishes are very keen to know what they can do to help. We'll be focusing on two aspects. One is the Hampshire Energy Cooperative, using renewable energies, and also then the greening campaign. So again, another important chance to discuss what people can do locally. And be under no illusion, sustainable long-term change in our lifestyle and behaviour is needed if we are really going to tackle this. So we are prioritising climate change, and we must enable and support everybody to play their role with us. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you, Councillor Warwick. Councillor Joy.
Thank you very much, Leader. I'm not going to duplicate at all things that have been said already. In particular, there are comments about sort of 2050 as a target dates for neutrality and so on. I am not unduly concerned about that, because it's essentially it is based on reality, achievable, as you said yourself, leader, earlier, and so on. And this is an evolutionary process. We are actively involved. We are developing ideas coming forward. Yes, there is a limit to how much we can do as a county council ourselves, but as a centre of influence, I am more than satisfied with what's come through this paper, that we are grasping the nettle here. It's really important. And one of the things, and particularly a particular thing which I think is in the report, which is a clear indicator to anybody who has any doubt as to the level of our commitment, is that every single decision paper and decisions that are taken in this authority going forward will have a standalone, separate impact assessment on climate change mitigation and resilience. And that is core. And if we take nothing more away from this than that, then I think the message is sound and emphatic.
Thank you, Councillor Joy. Councillor Glenn.
Thank you, Councillor Manns. You asked the Policy and Resources Select Committee many months ago to keep an eye on the 2050 vision, which incorporates, amongst many other items, climate change. We've already had one, or maybe even two presentations from Stuart Jarvis on this subject, and we will continue to have presentations. And I'm going to address Councillor Todd. I would be extremely grateful, Councillor Todd, if you could email me your recommendations, your suggestions, all of which I've written down. I think it's important that the Policy and Resources Committee actually get a presentation at some near point on your suggestions. Our job is to look at the practicalities and to get officer input, if necessary, get in expert witnesses to see if any of your points can be addressed or even brought forward. And our job is to then present it or promote it or recommend it to Cabinet at one of their future meetings. Now, I know that Cabinet, certainly this Cabinet, is very good at listening to what the Policy and Resources Committee does in fact recommend and has taken up recommendations. So, not only would I ask you to attend the meeting, and if we can't get it in the next meeting, we'll organise a special meeting for it, because it's an important subject. I'd also welcome members of the public who are here to come to these meetings. They are public meetings, and they can come to it, and they'll be most welcome to put in their opinions. And therefore, that gives you a chance, Leader, and this Cabinet, to look at the suggestions being put forward, the amendments being put forward, with some work having been done in the background. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Glenn. Let me just sum up very briefly on 2 points. First of all, climate change is a global activity. We must make certain that we lead the way in this council and in this county. But one thing we can also do is to ensure that we're coming up with the technical solutions here that can benefit people across the globe. That is something I'm personally very interested in, because it drives forward technology, it drives forward innovation, and it is innovation that has a global significance. And therefore, alongside what we're doing, looking inwards at our county, I want us to ensure that we are supporting those parts of the private sector that are coming up with the solutions to what is, as I say, is a global problem. And finally, to answer Councillor Todd's point about having a regular check on where we've got to, I think is what you said. What I will do is write above my signature for these Cabinet papers that I would like to have, I would like to see regular updates for this Cabinet as to what's actually happening on the ground and how we are actually carrying out our policies. So I hope that to some extent answers the comments you made earlier, Councillor Todd. And with that, are we all in agreement with the recommendations? Thank you very much. Moving on. Yes, should we have a 2-minute break for those members of the public that wish to depart? Next item. Item 10, the Prevent strategy. Graham,
Thank you,
over
sir.
to you.
So this report is intended to provide some information and hopefully assurance to Cabinet of work that we're undertaking within the Prevent agenda, which is the pre-criminal space to do with radicalisation in its many forms. I would like to just draw Cabinet's attention to the fact that this item, and indeed the next item on Hampshire's community strategy and safety work, overlap quite significantly. It's the first time we've presented a report in this format to Cabinet, primarily because it comes from specific responsibilities that are held by Hampshire County Council under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015. Previously, we've reported within other annual updates that have come to Cabinet, but we feel that such is the agenda, it's important that it has specific reporting to Cabinet on an annual basis. So the recommendations are as within the report, which seeks to get a noting of the work being undertaken by Cabinet and to receive a subsequent update in 12 months' time. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Comments from Cabinet colleagues? Are you all happy with the a very brief.
Chairman, as the Director pointed out, there's very much an overlap or interwoven with the next item, which is coming up, and in fact it highlights points made earlier about prevention being better than cure, and that is in fact a theme which runs through both of these.
Thank you, Councillor Joy. Are you happy with the two recommendations? Moving on, item 11, Hampshire Community Safety Strategy Group. Graham.
Thank you, sir. So, as previewed, so this report also sets out in terms of an update, hopefully to provide information and assurance of work being undertaken, not only by Hampshire County Council, but a wide range of system partners. And this follows from responsibilities under the Crime and Disorder Act 1998, which are being carried out to identify risks that the County of Hampshire faces across all of our communities. Cabinet will see within the appendix a detailed assessment of 6 key areas of risk affecting the County of Hampshire and the work that is being undertaken again by a wide range of organisations and bodies to tackle those risks. The only additional comments I would make, sir, is that Hampshire has benefited from a grant in terms of violence reduction. That work is being taken forward, and within the report is a recommendation that the Director of Public Health be able to oversee a small grants panel to award small sums of funding to a range of community organisations to further the Violence Reduction Unit's ambitions. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Comments from Cabinet colleagues? Councillor Joy.
Thank you very much again, Chairman. No, I would just sort of draw colleagues' attention to the breadth of this strategy group. It's set out in paragraph 6. I think it's actually quite a remarkable sort of blend of organisations, not just Pan-Hampshire, but also including the lead officers from the unitary councils as well. It's quite an extraordinary, a monster task and so on, and I'm only delighted that, in fact, it is chaired by the Director.
Thank you, Councillor Joy. Councillor Fairhurst.
You sure? Thanks. Yeah, I'd just like to just to mention priority 6, because I actually think that's perhaps one of the most important things we can do. When I was at a Prevent conference that we held here, one thing that came across very clearly was that young people who end up in the Prevent programme or even in counter-terrorism are so disenfranchised from the community. They don't feel they have a stake, they don't feel they have a future. I would say these are our young people and we should be looking after them.
I'd probably rephrase that slightly by saying we want to encourage them to look after themselves. That's not to be in any way denigrate what we need to do, but it's ultimately, I would argue, self-reliance is the best cure. Councillor Reid, on that rather sort of philosophical point.
I thought I'd make a point by way of a question really to Mr. Allen. This is an area in which the innovation of people to do bad things knows no bounds, and therefore people who are trying to fight the bad things that happen have got to be extremely agile and open to doing things in a different way. How have we built agility into our strategy?
Thank you, sir. An excellent question. So the purpose of the county-wide group is not to do work that is quite rightly being done in other places. Cabinet may remember that in previous years there have been some detailed updates undertaken around work to combat, for example, county lines. So there is a huge amount of partnership work that this group is, if you like, overseeing and providing some scrutiny and some challenge for, rather than doing directly itself. So all of that innovation, all of that work across many, many organisations, and as Councillor Joy said, it is something of a large enterprise in terms of the number of different organisations represented around the table. What I would say is, as the chair of the group, there is a huge amount of innovation and excellent partnership work that goes on day in, day out, that gets reported up to this particular board. So it is very agile. There's a huge amount of work that's taking place. Further development, the Violence Reduction Unit, for example, is a true collaborative arrangement between ourselves, primarily through our children's services, through public health, through Hampshire Constabulary, through the Office of the Police and Crime Commissioner, and many other partners, to look at how we do things differently. We can certainly, and we provided an update to Policy and Resources Select Committee around about 2 months ago in terms of the detailed work. I'm more than happy to forward that presentation on if it would help to see more detail of precisely what's taking place day in, day out.
Any other comments? You happy with the recommendations at 2A to C? Fine, moving on. Number 12, adult health and care. Graham Allen.
Thank you. I'm sorry, sir. You will be tired of my voice, but again, I will try and be brief.
No, we're never tired of your voice.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. So this will be a more familiar report to Cabinet. So this is the annual update in terms of annual safeguarding for adults across the county of Hampshire. It's a slightly backward-looking report on the basis that it's for the financial year 2018-2019. You'll see within the body of the report detailed information in terms of levels of activity and responses that have been undertaken. I would just point Cabinet out paragraphs 24 to 29. That provides an analysis of safeguarding initial inquiries and work that's been undertaken in the safeguarding adult space. Positively, we've seen the overall number of initial referrals made to us reduce through our multi-agency safeguarding hub, MASH. But actually the thresholds that have been set have meant that a slightly higher proportion, 36%, as opposed to previously 31%, have progressed to a further safeguarding inquiry. Although the percentage has risen, the overall number similarly has reduced. And that's, I would argue, is partly a consequence of a huge amount of work that goes on across the entirety of Hampshire, working with partner agencies, independent providers and others to keep adults safe within their own homes and within the services that they receive. The report also goes on to detail further activity that we undertake through our Client Affairs Service, and indeed points to changes that will be coming into place from October of this year in terms of changes to the deprivation of liberty safeguards arrangements, and introduces the liberty protection safeguards as a new formulation of how we can protect people who lack capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. Any comments from the Cabinet? Are you all happy with the recommendations? They are. Just getting back to them in a minute. Yes, recommendations 2 to 6. And the final item on the agenda, Annual Safeguarding Report for Children's Services.
Thank you, Chair. This is, as the title says, it's your annual report that we bring forward data every year so you can compare year on year. And this year you can take the added assurance from the external inspection that was carried out by Ofsted earlier this year, which rated children's services as outstanding across the piece. Within the report, you'll see that demand continues to grow for our services. So a very simple measure of that is the table on page 129 of your pack, but in section 23 of the report, where you can see that the number of initial contacts, that the number of people who pick up the phone, send us an email because they have a concern, has risen to 117,000 last year for the calendar year financial year 2018-19. You don't have to go too far back, just to 2015-16, to see that it was 77,000. That's the rate of growth, and that drives a lot of other activity as well, as you can imagine. Linked to that is the work of our transformation programme, which is highlighted in the report, and that's beginning to have a positive impact. We have fewer children in care, and although this report goes up to the end of March, we've extended the graphs in there so you can see that there's an impact beyond March. So that's looking really positive, but also that transformation work was endorsed by Ofsted as being good for children as well. So it's not just about saving money, this is about getting better outcomes for children, and it's not just us that think so, it's the regulator and the inspectorate. We have a continued focus on recruitment and retention, which is always a challenge, but we think we're making good progress in this area as well. And finally, the report highlights some of our external work for which we receive an income and which was again endorsed by Ofsted as having a positive impact on this authority. So I'll commend the report to you on that basis.
Thank you, Steve. Any comments from the Cabinet? Are you all happy with the report? Agreed. Thank you all very much indeed.